Pelicans rookie Derik Queen is sidelined for 12 weeks after surgery. That means Joe Dumars needs to shift his focus from the roster to the medical staff. I'll explain in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, here with y'all on this Monday, and we're already talking injuries. Are you kidding me? We're going to break down the Derik Queen injury. He's out for 12 weeks. When will he return? What's this just look like in general here? But before we even get to that, I want to get into Joe Dumars, the medical staff, the player performance and care team. We're going to have actually like a nuanced discussion about it. I'm going to share some things, my thoughts on the matter here and what Joe Dumars needs to do. So already this is happening. This team might be cursed. It's today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everyday. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast, and you can watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network every single weekday at 10:30 a.m. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. So we'll get into Derik Queen in a minute here, and what this injury means for his offseason, when we're likely to see him return, all of that. But I want to start with the the injury just in general and what Joe Dumars needs to do here. I'm going to refer to this collectively as just the medical team. There's a player performance and care team. There's a separate kind of medical staff from this. We're going to get into all of that here. And I want to start with this. I don't know if anyone's actually to blame for this injury. The way, the longtime everydayers have heard me say this before. Sometimes you can just have really rotten luck and there's not much you can do about it. The team has revamped even recently the player performance and care team that's supposed to help with like injury prevention, injury recovery, and all of that. But sometimes guys go out, get hit on the hand. We'll talk about that with Derik Queen in a little bit, and just get injured. And it's as simple as that. And, per the Pelicans PR email, Derik Queen underwent successful surgery to address a torn scapholinate ligament in his left wrist. The surgery is provided by Dr. Stephen Shin in Los Angeles, California. It occurred in the game against the Portland Trail Blazers. He will be reevaluated in approximately 12 weeks. Look, sometimes just injuries in the middle of a game happen, right? Broken bones happen, injuries happen, and there's not a lot you can do about it. It might seem like it's got to be on the Pelican staff for these just keep happening, and certainly things keep happening, but it can, and I'm not saying it is because I don't actually have an answer to this, it can also just be rotten luck, right? You can flip a coin 100 times and it comes up heads every single time. Is it likely? No. Is it possible that it can happen? 100%. And that's kind of how I view some of this stuff, right? When it comes to whether they need to be big changes here or people aren't doing their job, none of us actually know. I don't know. No other media people really know because we don't see that, and teams aren't going to release all of that information when it comes to the data they have on injuries and what could be done and all of that stuff, right? What I know is this team has some rotten luck when it comes to injuries. And that's enough for me to say this, right? Even with recent revamps and other things. And look, Oshner's not involved in this whatsoever, so I'm not going to get into the stuff with that. They're kind of used as a boogeyman here that I don't think is valid. It's just what it is, right? What I think matters here is perception more so than anything else. And the perception is not good. Regardless of anyone's actually at fault with the player performance and care team, the medical staff here in New Orleans, for all of the injuries that keep happening to this team, And I'm not calling for anyone to be fired, right? But look, the perception's bad. And the perception to others outside the organization matters, whether it's free agents, whether it's just, future draftees or future player agents, right? It does not look like you want to come to this team because you might get injured. There was a great joke that I saw about this that I'll repeat in the next segment here. That perception matters. And the perception around this team does need to change. And so Joe Dumars probably needs to shift his focus from the roster towards getting this stuff kind of resolved, right? They might need to just make a change for the sake of making change, in a sense, so that people think this team isn't okay with just injuries piling up. Even this, right? Like the Pelicans rookie who they traded up to get and gave away next year's future pick unprotected couldn't make it through 3 preseason summer league games. Again, it might not be anyone's fault. I don't know if it is. But like, my goodness, is this not the most Pelicans thing ever? And is that not exhausting? Exhausting. Just that it keeps happening. When this came through, when this alert came through, when I got the email from the Pelicans about it, I just kind of laughed. Laughter is, a defense mechanism and a coping mechanism here. And it's just like, yeah, this is the most Pelicans thing that could have possibly happened. And I bet other people around the league think the same thing. Dyson Daniels, when he left, was like, yeah, that team just might be cursed, right? He didn't actually say negative things about the medical staff, the player performance and care team, or anything like that. Just, it might be cursed. The Pelicans need to do something to try and kick whatever it is that's happening here. It's as simple as that, right? And that's going to be on Joe Dumars. Regardless of anything else, what I think is the most important thing when it comes to the medical teams around, NBA franchises, the most important thing is trust, that the players trust they're getting good care. And if you were to be a player that's a free agent that's debating if you should join the Pelicans or not, do you trust that you're going to get good care there? The answer is probably not. Now, you still might sign with the team because the money's right and everything, but trust like that matters. Trust with the players in the team matters. Zion Williamson did not really have that with some of the staff before David Griffin revamped it a couple of years ago. He revamped it. They were healthy. Then they were not healthy last year. So we don't know if that revamp actually worked or not, right? But DeJounte Murray, said some things recently that make you wonder about the trust. He's like, I couldn't get the table time I needed. He really kind of questioned things, said it was the worst year, that he went through of his NBA career. He was also going through a lot, and that's going to factor into that too. And that's not necessarily every other player's experience. But Joe Dumars listened to DeJounte Murray said at his media availability after the draft, and I was there, that, he immediately reached out to Murray to talk about it. He's talking to every single player, has been, right? It's kind of part of like a fact-finding early on part of his tenure here. And he's going to ask them questions of, do you trust the medical staff? Do you trust the training staff? All of that stuff, right? He's going to try and kind of get to the bottom of this and is going to listen. And if he feels there needs to be changes, there are going to be changes. And so that is important. Even if he doesn't feel there need to be changes, you might need to make some changes just to change the outside perception of this franchise, of this team. I do think that is something that needs to be of the utmost importance to the Pelicans. And from kind of talking with Joe Dumars and listening to him talk in other capacities, I definitely think that is an important thing that he is trying to do, is kind of change the way this team is viewed. But right now, with this injury to Derik Queen, kind of on the heels of that Murray interview, in just the past years of stuff, right? They need to do something. I don't know what that is. I don't have recommendations for it. They need to do something. It might just be rotten luck and no one's at fault here, but you've got to do something to change the perception of this team. That, I think, needs to be Joe Dumars' top task right now. So coming up next, let's look at Derik Queen, his injury, the timeline here, what he can do, when we think he might make a return. We got all of that and more coming up in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Monarch Money. You ever wish managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, it can be. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. So Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. So you can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. I used it to look at subscriptions, and there were a couple things I was paying for that added up to more than I realized. And I realized I just didn't need some of those. So I canceled 2 of them. Boom, I'm saving money already. I realized I was spending more on food delivery than I wanted to do. And once I saw the number that it was, it kind of changed my habits. And that's what's important about it. It's not just a one-time thing. It's going to change your habits to make you and help you accomplish your financial goals. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. Give me your thoughts on the Derik Queen injury and all of that in the comments down below. For your second listen, Tyler Shook is signed. Does that mean he's guaranteed to be QB1 going into training camp, which basically starts right now? Locked On Saints with host Ross Jackson is going to tell you what he expects from Tyler Shook, called what the contract was going to be. Make Locked On Saints your second listen today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we'll talk about Derik Queen in a second, but I want to tap into the Oshner discussion around this here. And look, I don't have any ties or any links to Oshner or anything like that. They're just not involved in this in any capacity. The teams have doctors that usually just come from local hospitals. Kind of every team has a team physician. But notice that this surgery was not performed by an Oshner doctor. If you look at other surgeries that the Pelicans have had, none of them have anything to do with Oshner. Oshner might come in and immediately look and try and, assess what's going on, particularly if the game's in New Orleans or if they're on the road and the doctors are around the team. But for the most part, players get second, third, fourth opinions, at least second opinions, and they choose who they want to perform the surgery and things like that. Oshner's not really involved. So I'm not trying to be don't blame Oshner. I don't particularly care either way. I'm just trying to kind of give you the facts of what the situation is, where Oshner has nothing to do with this, and just people work there when they're not dealing with the team kind of full time when it comes to all of that. So that's something that's worth keeping in mind here, that it's not Oshner sucks, so of course the team's injured. And as long as they have a partnership with them, look, Oshner's sponsoring the name of the facility and stuff, but it doesn't mean that they have any sort of thing. You could put any sort of name on there as long as someone's willing to pay the money. And look, it's good publicity, maybe not, I guess, for Oshner when it comes to this sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind of Oshner's connection to the franchise right now. So Derik Queen, torn ligament on his left thumb here, left wrist. He was kind of holding his thumb. It was wrapped in that 4th preseason game against the Oklahoma City Thunder. I want to shout out Pelicans Reddit here because they had some jokes. There was a thread on there that's at the top of it right now that was when did this happen? Right. And, you check the film to see when this occurred. And, I went back and rewatched most of that game, all the Derik Queen minutes. You can't really see when it happened. Maybe about with a minute to 45 seconds left. There were a couple moments where he went through traffic and maybe his hand got hit. And again, how do you try and prevent something like that happening? Right. I remember a couple years ago, Zion Williamson broke a finger because he was getting hacked a bunch. That's not really anything the medical staff can do. Soft tissue injuries, different story, certainly, but not really when it comes to something like this, right? I remember when it was Eric Gordon broke a hand, something like that, broke a finger, maybe it was a thumb, I can't remember. Came back in a game and it got hit again and broke another finger on his hand. Maybe it was the same one. It's been a while now. Sometimes it's just bad luck. It comes up heads every single time you flip the coin, right? Or whatever's worse than heads or tails kind of thing. And that's maybe what's happening here. But shout out Pelicans Reddit for the joke of when people are when did this happen? It was when he got drafted by the team, which now I'm not going to lie, that's a quality joke right there. That legitimately made me laugh out loud. It's when did the injury occur? It occurred when he got drafted by the team. It's given how this goes, yeah, all you can kind of do is laugh and then throw and break things probably because it's very frustrating how this all goes. So 12 weeks from when they announced the surgery, which was on July 18th, depending on when you listen to it. So 12 weeks is about October 10th. So that's, when he will be reevaluated. He can be reevaluated before that, after. It can be flexible and it can change too. These are an approximation, and we don't have an idea of if Derik Queen heals quickly or not here. But let's say he gets reevaluated on October 10th. The Pelicans start preseason October 3rd and 4th, against Melbourne United and then Southeast Melbourne Phoenix in Melbourne, Australia on the 3rd and 4th. They're playing 2 games down there. Doesn't seem like Derik Queen's going to play in those 2 preseason games. The Pelicans have 4 preseason games. The earliest we're probably looking at seeing him on the court playing is October 14th versus the Houston Rockets. That's the game in Birmingham. And then October 16th at the Orlando Magic at the Kia Center in Orlando. Those are going to be the preseason games he has a chance of playing. But when you say 12 weeks, right, when the Pelicans say 12 weeks, it's reevaluated in 12 weeks, right? That doesn't mean that you're good to go and everything's healed. He will not have gone through contact drills and things like that. And at least under David Griffin, and maybe this will change under Joe Dumars and whatever changes, if any, are made with the performance team, right? You've got to play 1-on-0, so no contact. Then 1-on-1 with some contact, 2-on-2, 3-on-3, working your way up to 5-on-5. Then you need a couple of practices of 5-on-5 before you get back out there and kind of get to it. It's disappointing because this is the type of thing that really is going to set him back. And the Pelicans, in a sense, are putting a ton of pressure on him, to go out and play well. Now, the good thing is he's a right-handed shooter, but this is someone who can finish with both hands. So it does kind of limit what he's capable of doing. And even if you can do some conditioning, and he should be focusing on conditioning, you could see he needs that at Summer League right now. And he can still do some of that once you get past the initial recovery period from the surgery and eventually work your way up to doing running and things like that. You can work on things like footwork and positioning and all of that stuff. That's important things for him to do during this time, and he will be. In a sense, this is good. I don't want to say good, right? But you get what I'm saying, that it's not a leg injury where it allows him to do a lot of that kind of stuff. So it's not going to be, a complete disaster, and it's not going to set him back, 12 weeks, but it's going to set him back some, I think. You could see that, he's not going to be able to work on a ton of passing, right? He's not going to be able to kind of build some chemistry with his teammates by going through training camp with them. Training camp, because of the preseason game starting so early this year, is likely going to be, a week or 2 before these preseason games. Is he going to be able then to get, work in the offseason with the team when they usually do a trip together in a couple of weeks to go just work out as a team together? They've done that the past couple of years at times. He's going to, he can be there, but it's not the same as building chemistry with your teammates on the court. And when you look at the center position for New Orleans, and we'll look at this in the future, it's not great, right? You have Misi, who looked fine, maybe, in Summer League. You have Karlo Makovic, who we didn't see play. You have Derik Queen, and then you have Kevon Looney. It's not the deepest group, right? Looney's good for 15 minutes a game, but not necessarily more than that. Misi shows promise, but still working on some things and didn't dominate Summer League. Not that centers do, so there's that. But you needed Queen to play an outsized role this year if you really want to make a big playoff push. This is the type of thing that delays that a little bit, and that's what's so disappointing and frustrating. Just sucks, right? No one's necessarily to blame for this. It can be a blameless situation, and one that just sucks. That's definitely, the one thing I can say for certain with this is it sucks. It just does. It's so unfortunate and such bad luck for this team that they continually have. But sometimes you make your own luck, and you need to do things to change that luck too. And we'll see what the Pelicans do. But there are things Derik Queen can work on. But look, he's going to be reevaluated, and then it's at least going to be 2 weeks away from playing. So if he gets reevaluated on, what did we say that was, October 10th? And then you're looking 2 weeks from then, you're looking at October 24th or so. The season's going to be underway at that point in time. So is he going to be ready for the start of the year? I'm not necessarily sure. And we'd like to see him be there. So, this is just an unfortunate situation, that the Pelicans are in partially because of their own making. And look, Queen had unreal expectations put on him, fair or unfair, by the trade, right? Like this is the type of thing that's going to follow him around for at least a little bit, until we see what that draft pick ends up being next year, and then who gets drafted and how they turn out. This is going to, again, I don't know if the Pelicans really realized the pressure that they were putting on him from outside people. And maybe Queen doesn't feel that, but kind of given some of his comments, like he realizes that he's under a lot of pressure with it. He thinks he can live up to it. I like kind of his attitude and the swagger that he has with that. And I think, it's not going to faze him too much, but the noise around this is going to be loud, right? The noise around this was already loud when it comes to it. And it was loud from Pelicans fans too, as it should be. They need to do something to change the perception of this franchise. Whatever that change might be, that's what Joe Dumars is paid the big money for. So we'll see what ends up changing there, but they got to do something. Let me know what you think they should do to change the perception of the team in the comments down below on YouTube. So coming up next, let's look a little bit at the salary cap situation, the roster situation. This is something we'll do a deeper dive on later in the week, but I want to give you a little bit of a primer with that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 11, almost 12,000 fans on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. Let me know if you're an everydayer in the comments down below. We're also on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. And for your second listen, the Locked On NBA podcast. No offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's quickly, as we start to wrap up the show, look at the Pelicans' kind of salary cap situation here. Right now, they have one open roster spot, which they made room for after waiving Antonio Reeves, who played pretty well in Summer League. We don't even touch on the final game with everything there. I was kind of actually shocked that Jeremiah Fears played given the injury to Derik Queen. And, maybe it would be better to avoid this type of stuff with the luck that this team has. But you had Antonio Reeves play pretty well in that game too. Fears did his thing. It was fine. Just not great. The numbers haven't looked good, but he's shown a lot of what you want to see just from the intangible perspective and showing that he's like an NBA player and has like potential to be really, really good. So they have one open roster spot. Right now, my calculations have them about, let's round up, call it $6 million from the first apron here when you factor in incentives, which count against the first apron, but not the luxury tax unless they hit. And it's more like unlikely incentives that aren't going to count because likely incentives do count. So about $6 million from the first apron. The luxury tax room they have that I calculated at is about $4.2 million right now. And essentially that's their hard cap, right? They're technically hard capped at the first apron, but they're not going to go into the luxury tax for this roster. I would be beyond shocked, right? Beyond shocked if that's the case. And I don't know if this roster is worth going to the luxury tax for unless you can get a difference maker of a player that will definitely elevate you into the postseason. But given they only have about $4.2 million in luxury tax space, one roster spot, you could sign Antonio Reeves. You could elevate, Lester Quinones to that two-way deal. Both of them looked pretty good in Summer League. Maybe they're kind of fighting for that. You could sign someone, we've heard rumors of a veteran point guard, something like that they want to try and go and get and add to this group, which I think makes a lot of sense. I'm a fan of adding someone like Russell Westbrook. I don't think, unless he already signed, I can't remember. I don't think Chris Paul is going to be a realistic option for this team in the slightest when it comes to it. But you also have a couple traded player exceptions that they could use too. And we'll look at who those players are in a show a little bit later. And I kind of have the list of names that kind of fit the criteria that they could be looking for. They could easily go and do that. You can just trade like a future second round pick for one of those guys and just absorb them into the traded player exception and just put them on the roster. As long as the guy's essentially making less than $4.2 million or less, they kind of slot right on in. And so that seems like it could work for this team. Those traded player exceptions aren't used very often. I don't place a lot of value or emphasis on them just because one, you don't see a team like the Pelicans just wanting to add salary, which is kind of what it does. And when we see those real big ones, they don't get quite used in the way that you want. They're smart to have, and it doesn't hurt you in the slightest to have them. They expire exactly 1 year from when they're created. But we'll see. They could add a guy, or you could just sign Antonio Reeves or sign someone in free agency. And I think there's some decent vet minimum guys in free agency too that are kind of wait a little bit here. But given that they're $4.2 million from the luxury tax, just one roster spot, right? Kind of from what I'm hearing around the team is no more big move is coming. So I don't expect any sort of big, massive trade. This is going to kind of be the roster going forward. That could change in the future. You see things heat up a little bit more in, mid to late September. So we're a couple of weeks away from potentially having that happen here. But this just might be the roster where they just do one other little addition to it. Whether that's free agency, whether that's a trade, that absorbs someone into a traded player exception or kind of moving some players around. I could conceivably see someone like Jose Alvarado moved in a deal, even though I would, hate that kind of thing. So that's likely the roster that we're seeing here on the New Orleans Pelicans. We'll do a deeper dive on, the moves they could make that maybe move the needle in some capacity, though likely anything they do is going to be smaller in scale and just be a move they like. That isn't going to be one of those things where oh yeah, that's a game changer for the team. But there are a few things that at least maybe move the needle a little bit, and that wouldn't be a bad thing to do as this team looks to kind of rebound next year and add maybe a little bit more depth to the roster here. So we'll cover all of that, but they don't have tons and tons of spending room. I actually want to get into the Jordan Poole trade on an aspect that I don't think is being talked about enough with that too. So we're going to kind of have a whole show built around transactions, maybe tomorrow as well. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. Just unfortunate injury news again for New Orleans. Maybe one day it'll stop, but they got to do something to change the perception. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at Nola Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. Leave a comment down below. I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.